Prologue, The Heroine's Journey. OJAI, California, January 2012. I've pulled off the curving mountain road onto what turns out to be the top of a steep driveway leading down to the house of the medicine woman, whom I just met on the phone only a couple of weeks earlier. I'm sitting and staring down the driveway, between a thick overhang of foliage, on a beautiful clear night that should feel magical but instead feels full of dread. I take a couple of deep breaths, trying to calm myself. I feel crazy. My mind, which was so focused on getting me here, is now suddenly betraying me, leaving me to feel vulnerable in ways that I hate. In this moment, I'm pounded by the same terrifying feelings I felt in past experiences when I put myself in situations that it's a miracle I lived to tell. The scariest aspect of those incidents was that whether I lived or died was in someone else's hands. And that lack of control may explain how I'm feeling here, in my car at the top of this driveway, as I try to get my bearings. I want to be grateful for this moment, for this opportunity, but a feeling of helplessness floods me. All I can think to do is pray with all my heart, as sincerely as possible. My hands press together. I try desperately to steady my mind. Don't be afraid, I tell myself. You are in peaceful, beautiful Ajay. Why are you so scared? Because, I answer right back, what if this actually kills me? 3 months earlier, in the wake of my 40th birthday, my biggest worry was, well, what if it doesn't? For 2 decades, I had been putting on a good face, going with the flow, telling everyone I was okay. Yet underneath, bouts of depression and overwhelming hopelessness had smoldered until they turned into raging hellfire in my broken heart. Unwelcome feelings of not deserving love made it harder to understand the disconnect between the so-called perfect life I had achieved and the well of loss I carried with me. Therapy helped up to a point. It got me to 40. But to what end? I would later be diagnosed and informed that I suffer from complex trauma with PTSD and dissociation. But without this guidepost, I was a chronic mess with no fix, no possibility to heal. Every morning, waking up was like walking the plank of doom. Could I make it to 4 p.m.? If I could, I had survived the day. I always wanted to sleep, but I never slept well. My children could put a smile on my face and were my only motivation to keep me going. But more and more, I could feel myself losing my grip of connection to them. With all of this, I was slammed by the reality that I'd been checking off boxes meant to define being enough to deserve having it all. What that meant to me was that I would be enough to be loved in a way that life didn't hurt anymore. Those boxes I'd been checking had not delivered the gifts that had been promised. I followed the rules. The rules we're told to follow. You work hard, make sacrifices for those you love. The rules tell you, be a doting mother and a doting wife, do the work required, and life turns into paradise. Nope. A loving relationship, harmony, peace. That happiness had yet to be delivered. On paper, it all looked grand. I had the beautiful family, the superstar husband, the lavish lifestyle, fame and fortune. I had my own career, the freedom and support to pursue creative outlets. The sweetest part was my kids, Jaden, Willow, and my bonus son, Trey, my 3 favorite people in the world. They were, hands down, the best thing that ever happened to me. Yet none of that prevented me from hitting the wall I was speeding toward at 100 miles per hour, knowing full well, this shit's gonna blow. I had sought help everywhere you can imagine, from goddess gatherings, silent yoga retreats, backpacking alone, studying every religion you can think of. You name it. I even went to Cuba and met with a padrino. None of it offered a lasting solution. Adding to my distress, Will and I weren't in a good place and hadn't been for a while. I couldn't make it right no matter how hard I tried. We couldn't hear or see each other at all. Confiding in my close friends seemed unfair to them and to Will and me. And so, by Thanksgiving, I'd fallen into despair and wanted to be on this earth less and less. This was not living. Suicidal thoughts were not completely new to me. What was new, I'd begun to think about how to have a fatal accident that wouldn't look intentional, for the sake of my kids. If I remained the way I was, what good would I be to them anyway? Besides, I told myself, they would be okay. They would have their father, a devoted and great dad. Their being okay, in my mind, depended on me doing a good job of making my death appear to be conclusively accidental. As grim as it may sound, the world had become less heavy now that I had a solution, a plan for my own exit, and I was resolved. A summer steeliness took hold. Driving around a turn on Mulholland Drive a few times, I settled on a specific cliff that might work. I'd have to summon the courage to drive fast over the side, probably at night. Fatal car accidents happened all the time on Mulholland. My only hesitation was that I might not die. Being practical, I pulled over to assess how steep the cliff was. Maybe in that moment I scared myself. Maybe I couldn't do it. I hated to imagine what would happen if it was a situation where I drove my car off the road and over the wrong cliff only to paralyze or disfigure myself. That would be a much worse nightmare for my children than losing me for good. Clearly, I would have to find higher, steeper cliffs somewhere, maybe outside of Leh, on my way to Big Sur, and that became the revised plan. But before following through, the universe intervened. In our living room, no less. It was there that a conversation took place that got my attention. Moises, age 17, and his brother, Mateo, 15, are 2 of Jaden's very good friends and have been like surrogate sons to me. Out of the blue, Jadon summoned me from the kitchen into the living room because he wanted me to hear the story Moises and Mateo were sharing about their father. They started to tell me about a trip their father, Cesar, had taken to Peru. They were really excited to share news of Cesar's experience with me, knowing that I'm a spiritual seeker like their dad. Mateo and Moises proceeded to explain that the expedition Cesar had made to Peru for 11 days was to experience ayahuasca. As I continued to listen, I became both hopeful and curious. Cesar happened to be in town, and I was eager to hear about his story firsthand, so we planned to meet at my house. He soon gave me a full graphic description of a life-changing experience. He explained that ayahuasca is a drink made from a plant that comes from the Amazon. His journey sounded daunting as he told me about it. Cesar, who is Colombian, speaks with a heavy musical accent. He described how ayahuasca was a deep psychological healer for him in ways he'd thought were impossible. He said it removed energy that masqueraded as physical ailments. I had known Cesar for a while, and I had never seen his eyes as clear, as bright, as they were at this meeting. He was evidence that Aya isn't some newfangled recreational drug trip. Actually, it isn't a drug at all, it is medicine and has been for centuries. The light in his eyes inspired me, his presence so glowing that I wanted whatever he had found. As soon as I started asking around, I was surprised by how quickly the universe opened a door for me to meet Mother Aya. A therapist friend of mine said, "Oh yeah, I've done it several times." I couldn't believe it. This is available right here in California. I don't have to go to Peru. She explained that a medicine woman she had worked with lived 15 minutes away, and she could arrange a journey for me as soon as I was ready. I couldn't arrange my ceremony fast enough. At this point, my level of desperation was so all-consuming. All I could think was, what do I have to lose? If it killed me, great, mission accomplished. If not, thank God. Yet here I am, 1 month later, just after New Year's Eve, coincidentally, the 14th anniversary of my marriage to Will, sitting in my car at the top of this hill, in Ajay, debating whether I should drive down this driveway or not. A memory surfaces. It was a hot, muggy Baltimore summer day, on a weekend outing to Beaver Dam Park, where the rock quarry's cliffs supported a platform that could be used as a high dive into the freezing cold water below. At age 7, I had daringly chosen to climb to the highest platform along with teens and adults. A sign was posted with the prominent warning, "Jump at your own risk." When I looked over the edge, I saw the risk I had chosen to take. I stood there, frozen, for hours. I watched people jump off that wooden platform over and over. It started to become a thing that there was a little girl too afraid to jump. Everyone who climbed up tried to give me encouragement. "It's not bad at all, it's easy, you can do it," I heard as folks went flying off toward that cold water in playful summertime bliss. Many would yell back to me once they resurfaced, "See, it's fun. Go ahead and jump." I stood there in limbo for so long that the point came when my mother yelled up at me, "Enough, you have to jump, Jada. Come on." Finally, I walked to the edge and jumped. Though I hit the water hard and it stung, I felt proud of myself that I'd done it, and the sting was worth the accomplishment. I'd conquered fear. I swam to shore, and it was a great day. With that memory, I muster the courage to get out of the car, after grabbing the apples, oranges, and flowers I have brought as an offering to Mother Earth and Mother Aya and to any other divine energies out there willing to look over me tonight. I'm on my hands and knees at the top of the driveway, praying. Please show me the truth I need to see, but please be gentle. Please, please show me if there is something wrong with me, and show me how to heal it, and give me the courage to do so. After getting back in the car, I take a deep breath and proceed slowly down the driveway, remembering Cesar's words. Once you go in, you can't change your mind. No matter how hard it might get, the only way out is the way through. Before I can tell you what transpired over the next 4 nights, and about the even more perilous but magnificent adventure that was to begin there, I must go back to the beginning. One of the biggest lessons I have learned, which is the main reason I wrote this book, is how important it is to share our journeys to self-worth. Returning to the scene of the deepest betrayals of our heart, buried in our origin story, is a harrowing process. It is like crawling on our stomach through a jungle of thorns and roses. A lot of stories await us. In the words of Clarissa Pinkola Est, whose Women Who Run with the Wolves has been a Bible to me since I was 19 years old, I am a well-written upon woman. Most of us are. Many of us, as women, to one degree or another, don't recognize the insidious ways we are made to feel unworthy. My belief is that every woman is worthy, a walking treasure, and deserves to live her life as the heroine of her own story. A woman has a right to her adventures, even if it means courting her shadows as guides to her brightest light. And she has a right to her pitfalls as well as her triumphs, and to the wisdom gained that leads to her self-actualization. When we as women have the courage to find keys to the treasure chest of ourselves, we find divine freedom, and with this, our lives are deliberately and unapologetically crafted by our own hands. My hope is that you will be encouraged and strengthened by the journey I'm about to share with you. The archetypal heroine's journey is less of a linear quest to go off and slay dragons and save damsels, as we know so well from the hero's journey paradigm, but more of a spiral out of chaos and into order, saving the damsel within ourselves, where each woman can learn how to Be her own savior, and any man or woman who loves her can learn how to support her in that. This, then, is a book about a woman's quest to find the power of unstoppable, indestructible love for herself, the key to her true empowerment, and the acceptance of the journey that delivered her there. Chapter 1. My Grandmother's Garden. It's close to midnight in the warm summer darkness, and I feel wild and free. I'm doing something I have no business doing, and I'm loving it. Living on the edge is already a habit, and, in the years to come, will be an addiction. I've just slipped out the kitchen's back door to an alley behind our modest row house on Price Avenue, a side street tucked in between two main thoroughfares in the working-class neighborhood of northwest Baltimore's Pimlico Heights. I press myself up and over the old metal gate and land on my feet like a cat. These are the moments when my dance and gymnastics classes come in handy. I charge down the alley, turning a sharp left to head south, then east, then north, in a kind of horseshoe direction. I'm 13 going on 14, and I'm on a mission to see my 16-year-old boyfriend, who works the overnight shift at the 7-Eleven. It's about a 25-minute walk that by day is full of the noisy hustle and bustle of business and traffic, but now is mostly quiet. Small sounds, a delivery truck here or a train rattling by over there, punctuate the silence. This is a working-class neighborhood that's butted up against a hood that is, let's say, tricky. All kinds of characters trickle into this area, especially at night. Gotta keep my eyes open and my guard up. My route runs past the Reisterstown subway station, which is how I get around when moving to different parts of town, followed by a shopping mall with a Payless and a Kmart that my mother and I frequent, and then along sleepy residential blocks where many of the streetlights are out. At times it's so dark I can barely make out the homes of friends who live in the neighborhood. My stops and starts take me across two well-trafficked parkways, still in the darkness, and, finally, up a less dark stretch that will land me at the brightly lit glass doors of the 7-Eleven. Dressed in jeans, a t-shirt, and sneakers, I'm tomboy cute right now. I have my hair pulled back into a sleek pony knot with the edges slicked down by Pro Style Gel, and because of the humidity, I probably hit him with a Tancho stick as well. I gotta be cute but not stupid. 4 years earlier, when I was 9, I was leaving my grandmother's house to walk to a nearby shopping mall. Her neighborhood is considered upper middle class, predominantly white, with a huge Hasidic Jewish community. At screaming distance from my grandmother's, I wasn't overly concerned when a young white guy driving a beat-up gray car pulled over next to me on the curb. He leaned toward the open passenger window. "Hey." "Yes," I answered. "Have you seen a puppy around here?" I leaned in a little closer. "No, I haven't seen a puppy. Do you know where Graveyard Street is?" As he spoke, I noticed him jerking off through the opening of his dingy trench coat. "No," I muttered, and I kept walking. The flasher didn't drive off immediately. By reflex, I glanced to my right without turning my head, making sure he didn't jump out and try to grab me. Right there, fortunately, was a synagogue parking lot. I moved toward it as if it were my destination, just in case. I kept strolling, and he pulled off. I turned to watch him leave and made sure he didn't turn the corner to come back around. He screeched off, but I kept my eyes on him until he disappeared. In that moment, I learned you gotta have eyes in the back of your head, show no fear, and act like you're not fazed. You can tell the heart of a predator by what they hunt. Eventually, I learned that if you don't look like easy prey, cowardly predators will move on. Part of staying safe was hiding my feminine nature and taking on a more masculine bravado in how I carried myself. Even as a kid, I wasn't scared, I was disgusted. Disrupted, but not scared. It was moments like these that taught me I had to be rugged and super vigilant. Not only that, but yeah, I learned early that there ain't no such thing as a safe neighborhood. What I appreciate about the hood I'm in tonight on my way to the 7-Eleven, there ain't no lies. It's not pretending to be something it's not. Safe. I know what it is. My instincts are dialed in, and I've learned how to navigate this concrete jungle. I know how the various predators move, and I'm dressed to move quick, fight as hard as I have to, or retreat and hide. But tonight, the air is full of excitement, and I can't wait to see my dude. It's the summer of 1985, and at 13, I'm coming of age on these streets. My mother, Adrienne, newly separated from my stepfather, is an RN in a hospital maternity ward and has recently begun working graveyard shift from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. She is like most single moms who work hard to keep the lights on and food on the table, who can only hope and pray that they put enough fear in their children to adhere to the laws they lay down about how to behave when they aren't present. And, of course, I am not that child. In fact, I make it my business from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. to ignore every law my mom ever thought of. And that's how I feel on this balmy summer night. Free, unguarded, unwatched, loving my wildness. There is something comforting about the warmth of the air in these late hours. The muggy, oppressive heat of the day, when humidity levels tend to rise to miserable heights, is gone. Years later, I would often summon nostalgic memories of East Coast summer nights like this one. The thickness of that air can feel almost protective, like a warm hug. In hindsight, I thank all the powers of the universe for hovering over me in these days. It's true that Pimlico Heights, so named for the neighborhood's proximity to the racetrack, had not yet fallen into the no-man's land of the trickier hoods like Liberty Heights and Park Heights that bordered us. Like I said, there ain't no such thing as a safe neighborhood. Yet when I catch my first glimpse of the warm and welcoming glow of the 7-Eleven, all I am ready for is the next chapter of young love. Though Mark is not my first boyfriend, he's my most serious so far. He's also fun and cute, with a little smidge of quirk. Black and Asian, Blasian before it was even a term, tall and skinny. He has a wide toothy grin and a deep voice that makes him sound much older than he looks. Mark makes me laugh, and not because he's trying to be funny. For the last several weeks, I've been making this trek to visit him, and he says the same damn thing every time I arrive, swinging into the too bright 7-Eleven. Jada, you know you shouldn't be down here. I just look at him, grin back, and mutter something. Like, boy, yeah, you say the same thing every time I come in here. You know you crazy doing this. He presses this point, just like always. Sometimes, if his shift is over early, he'll walk me home or give me a ride. But not tonight. It doesn't matter, I'm gonna enjoy this time with him anyway, and I'm not afraid to walk home. For the next nearly 5 hours or so, I hang right there next to the hot dog cooker and the Slurpee machine, making small talk with Mark, snacking or not. Sometimes he tells me about his troubles at home, and sometimes I tell him about mine. And then, before I know it, right before dawn, it's time to roll. The night has all but gone, and I'm barely on my way before the first streaks of morning light break across the sky. The excitement I felt hours before is replaced by a sense of accomplishment mixed with melancholy that the night has ended. Now my focus is making it home before my mom does, because if she ever finds out where I have been, that's my ass. For real, by 6 a.m., the grind of another hot, muggy summer day has begun. Traffic thickens on the parkways, and folks are heading out for early shifts. The sounds of news and music rev up from open windows and from car radios. All the more reason to hustle home. The irony is not lost on me that I watch out for unpredictable dangers by night, but by day I have only to fear the wrath of Adrian. As is my drill, I slip back inside our row house, locking the door behind me, and fly up the steps to my bedroom. When my mother arrives home around 8 a.m., she doesn't come upstairs to check on me right away. Why would she? Her assumption, I'm sure, is that I'm safe and sound, fast asleep in bed, where I've no doubt been all night. But safe is just one of many lies at this point in my life. Whenever I think of my origin story, it's not really set on the streets of Baltimore. I think of Marian's garden. Marian was my mother's mother. Some of my earliest memories were formed at her side, out in her garden, learning powerful lessons I would use for the rest of my life. Adrian was the youngest of the 4 children born to Marian and her husband, Gilbert. My grandfather was an MD who served as the head of anesthesiology at Provident Hospital, which catered to a predominantly black community. Grandfather maintained a private practice as a GP, smoked a pipe, said little, and adored his wife. I was the firstborn grandchild. Because my mother and my father, Jada Pinkett, were only married for just over a year, and Mom was only 17 when she became pregnant with me, we moved back into her parents' house when I was a toddler, and for all intents and purposes, that was home for much of my childhood. The house was nestled in a family-friendly upper-middle-class neighborhood. We were one of 2 black households in our immediate area, which was northwest of downtown Baltimore. In one direction, there were larger, more opulent single-family homes with big backyards. In the other direction, Lower Park Heights, was an area torn by the ravages of addiction, violence, and poverty. Directly across the street from us were large apartment complexes almost entirely inhabited by members of the Hasidic Jewish community. Our neighbors definitely had their own flow. Grandmother taught me very early about how the Hasidic community lived and the importance of respecting their customs. She explained that I should not be offended if they didn't socialize with us. Keeping to themselves was simply their way of life. Groups of Hasidic women, in wigs and long dresses, would walk up and down the neighborhood, nearly every day, pushing babies and strollers with other young ones in tow. The Hasidic men all had beards and wore big hats and prayer shawls tucked under their jackets with strings that hung below their pants pockets. I was always fascinated by their attire, not knowing the reasons behind these choices until many years later. I also liked watching the families out together on the street, coming and going, usually to and from the synagogue. In the process, I was taught to respect differences and that those differences didn't have to make us hate one another. It was important to my grandmother that I could find common ground with anyone, no matter what. The value of being well-rounded was at the heart of how she crafted my education and experiences. She was the center of my world and the center of well-being for each of her 4 children, their spouses, significant others, and my cousins. There was so much love in her house, as well as in her garden. Throughout childhood, I was convinced that my grandmother had the biggest backyard in the universe. Her multi-tiered garden was, to me, as impressive as any park I had ever visited. There was so much space in the backyard, and grandmother cultivated all kinds of smaller gardens within it, so much so that she always had flowers blooming or vegetables ready to be picked or leaves to be raked, no matter the season. Going back to the age of 5 or 6, I was given gardening jobs that allowed me to not just witness the cycles of growth but know that I had helped make them possible. During the fall, I would dutifully help rake leaves, which forever after made me love that time of year. Is this right? I remember asking grandmother, which, by the way, was the only acceptable way I could refer to her. After inspecting the pile of leaves I had going, she gave me a small nod of approval and said, "Great job, Angel Pie," using the affectionate nickname she had for me. The best part came next, leaping high into the air with my gymnastic skills and then falling backward into the multicolored piles. The smell of the crunchy leaves stayed with me long after I'd come up for air and scrambled out. Sometimes the raking of leaves became a family affair. We'd all be out there with rakes, my grandparents, me, and some of my cousins. We would jump in the leaves and laugh together, making a full-on mess. Eventually, grandfather, a handsome, slender man with a gentle might, would fling one hand as if shooing something away and say, "Okay, that's enough now," and we would get back to work. I was a very talkative and inquisitive child. When grandmother and I were heading out to the garden, I would ask her all kinds of questions about all kinds of things. West Indian and a Howard University graduate who went on to become a licensed social worker, grandmother was a trailblazer, having been one of the pioneers in the teaching of sex education in Baltimore schools. Marian had a refined, melodic way of speaking, no patois, no hint of her Jamaican heritage. After all, she was born in Boston and had not lived with her immigrant family since she was 13 years old. One day on our way outside, I pointed to a photograph in the hallway. The pretty young woman in the picture was wearing an unusual style of dress. "Who is that?" I asked. "Oh," she said, and beckoned me to continue outside with her to the toolshed. "That's me." "In India." "India." "Yes, I was an undergraduate at the time and received a fellowship arranged by the wife of Howard Thurman, Sue, to study in India for 6 months. Grandmother explained that the dress was called a sari, and then described how exciting it was to travel all the way there in the mid-1930s as part of an invited delegation of African American leaders and students. On that same trip, Howard Thurman, a theologian, professor, and civil rights activist who became a key influence in the work of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., met with none other than Mahatma Gandhi to discuss the role that nonviolence could play in the overturning of oppression. Howard and Sue, an activist and author in her own right, were so important to Marian that they became godparents to my Aunt Sandra, my mom's oldest sibling. Grandmother and Sandra were present in 1963 for Dr. King's historic I Have a Dream speech at the March on Washington. The little bit I knew about Marian's story after India was that Gilbert, her college boyfriend, asked her to marry him soon after her return. Gilbert didn't talk much, but he was a solid fellow, a provider and a consistent man of his word. Often I'd see him in his armchair reading or smoking his pipe. The fragrance of burning pipe tobacco is something I've loved ever since. I'd catch him with his eyes closed on occasion and finally asked one day, "Grandfather, are you sleeping?" "No, I'm just resting my eyes," he replied, not bothering to open them at all. A brief smile passed across his face, resting his eyes. Poor Gilbert. He must have been wondering, didn't we just get our grown kids out of this house? Now we have a little one up in here. I was in everybody's business. In my grandmother's house, our day-to-day life had an orderliness. Having set jobs to do made me feel I was contributing. They might have been hard, but they were never boring. That was because Marian Banfield understood how to turn the mundane into magic. Looking back, I can see that she was, in fact, cultivating 2 gardens. One of them was the garden in her backyard. Her other garden was me. Grandmother poured everything she had into my cultivation, growth, and learning, just as I watched her pour everything into the soil of her garden. Literally. Once, as we carried out the compost bucket, Marian egged on my curiosity. "What do you think is in there?" I smelled. "Lemons, lemon peels, yes." In that bucket there were also fish heads, apple peels, coffee grounds, and whatever scraps had been collected in the kitchen. This was decades before composting became mainstream. "See, we're getting the earth ready. The worms will come and till the soil for us. In a few days, we can plant seeds." My grandmother's garden was my school and my playground. Outside in that backyard, I spent untold hours exploring, either by myself or with my cousins when they came to visit. The power of my imagination taught me how to entertain myself all on my own. One of my favorite solo games involved building a booming imaginary restaurant on the stone steps that separated the 2 tiers of the garden. There was plenty of dirt available for making mud pies that I'd cook up with weeds I picked and then decorate the tops with flower petals. Dandelion mud pies became the specialty of the house. If I wanted to go on an adventure, I could hop on my big wheel and cruise across the small wooden bridge that separated 2 sections of the garden. Crossing from one part of the backyard to another was freedom. Every day I found new treasures waiting for me outside. At that first tier was grandmother's rose garden, and in the beauty of each bloom and in the thick thorns on each stem, I saw how nature created a boundary to protect its prize. Up above the roses was the vegetable garden. String beans, tomatoes, snap peas, and zucchini, all in abundance. To the right was the strawberry patch. There were other fruits, but I loved the strawberries the most because that was where the rabbits gathered. In spring, where the baby bunnies would appear. One spring day when I was 5 years old, I was in the strawberry patch, about to pick up one of the baby bunnies, and grandmother stopped me, warning, "Angel Pie, don't touch the baby rabbits." If the mother smells your scent on her baby, she won't take care of that bunny. Okay, I said, disappointed. She had to remind me a few more times because I was so in love with the tiny rabbits. Instead, I resolved to take on the job of monitoring how many there were and making sure their little hollow was safe. Over the months that followed, I saw them grow up and eventually leave our garden, hopping off to other gardens to have bunnies of their own. Everything grew if given enough sun, fertilizer, and the right amount of water. Evidence was in every patch of dirt. There were purple pansies and orange marigolds that I'd helped grandmother plant. There were tulips of many colors all around and another small herb garden where grandmother grew mint. Marion loved to drink fresh mint tea. She brewed it almost daily. Mint was one of the first things I planted when I became an adult and started my own garden. By that time, I had been away from Baltimore long enough to realize that what I'd thought was the biggest backyard in the universe was not nearly as big as it once seemed. Marion always modeled a work ethic. Her point was that even the most basic chores, like weeding, required thought and effort. Grandmother ran a tight ship. She loved a spick and span house, and to this day, so do I when I tell you that I was taught how to clean a house from floor to ceiling. I am not exaggerating. Cleaning the bathroom was not just scrubbing sinks and tubs and toilet bowls. It was a procedure, scrubbing and cleaning every inch of porcelain, including all the cracks around the base of the toilet. Cleaning the floors and windows was not easy, but nothing came close to tackling the floorboards. She wanted those floorboards to look brand new. Grandmother was not stern, but she was a serious taskmaster. Angel pie, I need you to make sure you scrub. So I'd scrub. Instead of getting frustrated, I accepted these lessons as a challenge. I had a capacity to be meticulous anyway. I guess it has to do with being a Virgo. The real test, though, came when I finished one section of the floorboards and grandmother put on a white glove and wiped her finger across the top. I'd hold my breath every time. If she raised a clean gloved finger, I could keep going. If not, as in most chores not done to her liking, grandmother had no problem making me do the same section all over again. The larger lesson was a lasting one, that how you apply yourself in the small daily tasks is how you will apply yourself in the big tasks of life. I learned all that she had to throw at me: dusting, washing window panes, setting and clearing tables, doing dishes, pots, and pans. Cleaning right was all about paying attention to details, but those floorboards, though, they had to be pristine. I fear a white glove to this day. There was no spanking allowed in my grandmother's house. No tickling, either, and we were not allowed to play hide and seek. These rules were not random, and when challenged, grandmother pointed out that spanking or beating children was reliving the horrors of slavery. Tickling had been used as a method of torturing prisoners of war in many cultures. As for hide and seek, she simply didn't like it because, as she explained, I was once scared out of my mind when someone who had been hiding behind a door jumped out at me. Her house, her rules, and no one dared to defy her. Marion was remarkable at more things than I can count, but she was a terrible cook. She liked to create her own dishes, which sounded awful as she excitedly described them and were even worse when served. Braised cow tongue with sour cream, made in the crock pot, comes to mind. If only Piero, the big black standard poodle I loved and rode around like a pony, had been allowed near the kitchen table when we ate, I could have sneaked him the food I didn't want. No such luck. If I didn't finish my plate, well, that's what I would be eating the next day, and the day after that if necessary. My grandmother did not play wasting food. Once I made the mistake of taking a bite of something she had prepared and saying, "Ooh, this is nasty." "Don't say that word," she corrected me. "If you don't like it, you can say that it's unpleasant or distasteful." From then on, I primarily used unpleasant to describe much of grandmother's cooking. Grandmother's consistent response would be, "Food is not meant to be enjoyed. It should be eaten for nourishment." Being a foodie was not my grandmother's focus. Thankfully, Marion could pull off a classic breakfast, and because of her absolute joy in all family celebrations, birthdays, Thanksgiving, and especially Christmas, she could bake, in my view, like nobody's business. She taught me to bake a lot of the basics: cookies, cakes, and pies from scratch, not to mention different kinds of breads. Marion was an endless source of fascination to me. She was a socialite, widely respected in the community. Forest Park Senior High School at one point named a library after her, and my middle school, Falstaff, named a garden after her as well. She was outspoken and, throughout her life, remained active in the civil rights movement. She had been a key player in Baltimore's politics, so much so that she became the chair of Kurt Schmoke's campaign when he successfully ran as the first black state's attorney of Maryland, which set him up to later become Baltimore's first black mayor. Grandmother had seen the world, traveling to places like Kenya and Ecuador and Russia. They seemed so exotic and so far away, I couldn't even imagine them. But then she would vividly describe her travels and give me a little souvenir, dolls from South America and necklaces from Africa, and those places would come alive. Many of those keepsakes live with me still. As early as I could recall, grandmother had me in tap dance, piano lessons, and pretty soon after that, tennis, gymnastics, and whatever else seemed enriching. She wanted me to read what she considered classic children's literature: Alice in Wonderland, Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, The Learning Tree, Gulliver's Travels. My reading was part of the summer school program she created just for me because she believed I could have summertime fun and still make room for learning. There was no such thing as taking a break from education. Not everything she devised made sense to me, but here is what I was sure of, that my grandmother loved me to pieces. And it was no use resisting her will, because I wouldn't win. So, later on, when she decided to coordinate an after-school program to teach kids flower arranging at my middle school, I went with the flow, sort of. My inner monologue sounded something like, "Who does this? We are going to learn pottery," grandmother announced one day when I was 8. "It's wonderful to learn how to throw clay on the wheel." So wonderful, in fact, that she enrolled herself in an adult pottery class at the same time. My mother rarely interfered with grandmother's curriculum, except when I was in the first grade, and was shamed by a ballet teacher for being disruptive in class. To make her point, the teacher took me out of my pink tutu, put me in a black tutu, and stuck me in a corner facing the wall. When I told my mom about the incident, she saw red and confronted the teacher. My mother could not believe that the woman had the audacity to put the only black child in her class in a black tutu as a punishment. My mother had no qualms about making that point in the fierce Adrian tone that, to this day, is a sign to get out of the way. To add more fuel to her fire, it turned out that back in junior high school, my mother was also put in a corner for being talkative. Upon hearing about it, Marion had immediately gone to the school. So not only was Adrian irate at the level of humiliation I had suffered, but putting her foot down was in her DNA. Needless to say, that was the end of that ballet class. During family gatherings, I was regularly enlisted by Marion to give a performance of some sort. For years, she would have me play "Oh Christmas Tree" for the holidays. I didn't always love playing the piano, but it was a tradition. One year I had the daring idea to write, direct, and star in a short play I'd conceived to celebrate the nativity story. Grandmother was pleased, and I took charge, making sure that every cousin had parts. I quickly wrote a script with lines for Joseph and Mary and a speech for myself. When it was time to perform, I called everyone to the living room, came out in front of my cousins, took a bow, and introduced the characters, concluding with "Thank you all for coming. Please enjoy the show." The adults tried to hide their laughter as I directed from the sidelines, whispering to Brett, "Go, go." As per the script, he stepped forward and recited, "Now the Banfield children will present a program. The first number is Silent Night, sung by Jada." We continued with 5 more songs until our finale, The 12 Days of Christmas, sung all together. It was all sweetly ridiculous, but it was clear even then that I enjoyed performing. Grandmother believed I was going to do something in this world. She would say, "Angel Pie, you're special." In remembering this period, I often ask myself, what was the thing she saw in me that made her say this? I'm not sure, but she said it enough that I believed her. Marion planted every possible seed at her disposal in order for me to become whatever I so chose. She didn't say, "Learn to challenge the status quo." She didn't have to, because I watched her do it. She didn't say, "Don't take everything at face value." She wanted me to value my own opinion. A light flicked on for me at a young age when we were walking through the supermarket and I asked if we could buy Nesquik, which I like to put in my milk. "We can't buy any Nestle products anymore." She paused and explained, "We are boycotting Nestle." The reason was that they were promoting their brand of baby formula in Africa and discouraging African women from breastfeeding. Babies in Africa were dying because the water used to make the formula wasn't clean. I was horrified, and suddenly resolved, we can never buy Nestle products again. I knew immediately that was the right thing to do. This was one of my first lessons of activism. Grandmother never talked to me about the horrors of racism she had witnessed and lived through. She was very optimistic about social change for Black people and always explained how we could support and uplift one another. Her belief was that a child's mind should be fed with hope so they would work for change as an adult. Yet she felt just as strongly that it was essential to know your history. For that reason, in January 1977, she took exception to the ironclad rule of my 8 p.m. bedtime. This was for the miniseries Roots, adapted from the groundbreaking book by Alex Haley. For those 8 episodes, I sat at Marion's side and was spellbound. My reactions were complicated, fascinated, and confused all at once. That big black chain around Kuntakint's neck and what it looked like for people to be whipped until they bled were images that stayed with me. My grandmother found it important for me to participate in this historical event, the unprecedented major TV broadcast of a critical part of African American history, even if it was painful to watch. Whereas Marion was prominent in Dr. King's Combat Hate with Love movement, my mother and my Aunt Karen came of age throwing Black Power fists in the air. Either way, taking a stand against injustice was instilled in me early. Marion called herself an atheist, but her mission was to expose me to all religions and philosophies so I could find meaning for myself. She did not believe in organized religion, but she believed deeply in one guiding principle: love. The ideal setting to learn love and acceptance, she decided, was the Ethical Society, where we attended meetings every Sunday. It was unheard of for a Black West Indian family at this time to choose to not go to church. We were supposed to be up in some Baptist church somewhere. Not Marion. Status quo was out the door when it came to her truth. Grandfather, grandmother, and I would drive together in our yellow Volvo, which both my grandparents considered the safest and most reliable car on the road. The Ethical Society meetings were held in a modest home not far from us. We'd enter the home and see that, as usual, chairs had been set up for a morning lecture with a podium in the middle. We would sing songs about the winds of change and peace and listen as different speakers talked about bringing humanity together through understanding and love. The children would later move to a smaller room upstairs and learn about different religions practiced in different settings and cultures. Meetings of the Ethical Society exposed me not just to the teachings of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and other faiths, but to the histories and cultural practices of their followers. It was enchanting to hear about far-off lands and the customs and rituals that expressed the mysterious communion followers found with their understanding of God. Those Sunday meetings prepared me to become a lifelong seeker of spiritual knowledge. The more I learned, the more I believed that all forms of faith have valuable information to offer, but they all reflect one core belief: God is love. Jesus could be a path, as could Allah and Buddha. But the fact was the higher power was going to make itself available according to an individual soul's needs. It became my lasting view that the higher power, no matter what you call your source, lives within the temple of your heart. Of course, at such a young age, I didn't have the language to articulate these beliefs to my grandmother. I just knew that my heart and my mind were allowed to be open in that place, because grandmother made the choice to take me there. Marian was always youthful in my eyes and very beautiful, with the most glowing cocoa complexion and a smile that could electrify any atmosphere. Yes, she was short, but a powerhouse with a capital P. We were not a huggy, touchy family, but I do recall from when grandmother held my hands or scrubbed my fingernails that she had beautiful soft skin on her hands. Her hair was black and silky straight. She was Jamaican, with East Indian blood, as well as having a grandfather who was a Jewish man from Portugal. Gilbert, whose family was from Barbados, had a true immigrant experience and could recall traveling to the United States as an only child with his parents through Ellis Island. He had striking good looks even in his later years. Beauty ran in the family. My mother was always a true head-turner, and so, too, were her big sisters, my aunts Karen and Sandra. My uncle Leslie, like my grandfather, was very attractive. Marian would never boast about this, only acknowledging, "I have a handsome family." Anything more would have been vain. And she made it clear to me that looks were not something to rely on, yet one more reason to focus on cultivating our minds for success. The idea that girls and women should not play on their looks was ingrained in me from an early age. The most revealing conversation I ever had with Marian took place one day when we were sitting together in the library, family room, and I asked about an old sepia-tone photograph on the first shelf above her desk. It was of a woman with a baby on her lap and a little girl standing next to her. The girl's expression was a bit somber, and the eyes of the adult woman were vacant. "Grandmother, who's that?" was all I asked. She took the photograph down, stared at it for a second, and then pointed to the woman in the photo, saying, "That is my mother." And then she pointed to the girl who was standing and said, "That's me. She was so cute in her little dress." Grandmother pointed to the child on her mother's lap. "That was my baby sister, but she died very young." I was immediately sad but wanted to know more. Her mother, my great-grandmother, apparently, suffered from paranoid schizophrenia and was institutionalized in Boston by her husband. My great-grandfather. I understood that Marian's mother was not available to really care for her children. When grandmother told me of her childhood trauma, I couldn't believe it. In my eyes, she had a perfect life. Grandmother worked very hard to give that perception, but it could not have been further from the truth. As an adult, I found out that Marian traveled back and forth to Jamaica during her childhood. During a visit when she was 13, she got pregnant. The details, under what circumstances she was impregnated, are not clear, but Aunt Karen, the family historian, and I came to the consensus that probably Marian wasn't aware of what sex was. She never gave the impression that she had been raped. It seemed as if she simply didn't know what was happening, and it was an innocent mistake. The fact that she was so adamant about teaching me, at an early age, how reproduction worked leads me to believe that ignorance was the biggest culprit in her teen pregnancy. It would also explain why she felt compelled to become a sex educator in the school system when it was still taboo. It is painful to imagine the shame and rejection she faced being black, the daughter of immigrants, 13, pregnant, and unwed. In the mid-1920s, no less. She was motherless, and her father wanted nothing to do with her, so she bore that child with little to no familial support. She gave her baby boy up for adoption and went into the foster care system, where she was placed with a white family. While she lived with them, she served as a maid to earn her keep. The horror of her going through all of this as a child, alone, haunts me. Inside this proud, accomplished matriarch was a hidden history of a little girl made to feel unworthy before I was even dreamed of. The miraculous part is that Marian did not let the poisons ruin her desire for a good life, picture perfect, as the wife of a prominent doctor and one of Baltimore's more distinguished socialites. Marian was far from perfect, but she was a woman of worth, and a hell of a heroine. She had built her life an extraordinary garden in spite of the past. By the time I came around, she was learning how to live not in her pain or her loss but in her own self-love and the love of the family she cultivated. Her house was a place of warmth and refuge not just for me but for the whole family. She had created a sanctuary for her children and her children's children, a lasting legacy of love. In grandmother's house, within her handmade haven, I saw how familial love could pull you through seemingly impossible times. I witnessed the miracles of healing in my grandmother's house for her grown children, each of whom, at different stages, needed to return home for a reprieve from the harsh world. She didn't always agree with her children, but she loved them fiercely. Her grace, tenacity, and devotion were constant reminders that no one is beyond the possibility of redemption. This lesson of faith was the greatest gift of my young life. It was here in my grandmother's house, in my grandmother's garden, that life was right. Life had purpose, and life was full of love. I heard it in the nightly sound of my grandmother at the piano playing Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata after she put me in bed. As much as I hated to have to go to bed, listening to her play that piece, in particular, was so soothing. She played it beautifully. I don't think she could go to sleep without playing it. I know I couldn't go to sleep without hearing it.